This episode of Literary Treks is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading, in case I got bored.
Thank you, everyone, for downloading episode 211 of Literary Treks, your dedicated Star Trek books and comics show here on Trek FM. I'm just one of your hosts. Joining me, as he does every week, is the Bashir to my Garak, Bruce Gibson. Bruce, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Garak. How are you? I mean, Dan, how are you doing? Wait, who's Bashir?
We'll go with you.
Okay. That's what I thought.
Excellent.
So yeah, I don't know if I can trust you, Garak. I mean, Dan, or whoever you think you are. But yeah, it's great to be here.
You can trust me that we're going to have a really interesting episode today, because in the feature we're going to be talking about Deep Space Nine, A Stitch in Time, the novel all about Garak by the man himself, Andrew J. Robinson. But first, we have our news segment, and we've got something special for you in the news segment here as well. There's a new recent release called A Field Guide to the Aliens of Star Trek The Next Generation. And we've got the author with us today, Zachary Auburn. Zachary, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. It's really great to have you. So, let's jump right into it. A Field Guide to the Aliens of Star Trek The Next Generation is not really your typical book. Bruce and I had the pleasure of taking a look at this and reading through it, and it's a really interesting book you've crafted here. Tell us a little bit about the process of putting this together.
So this book started out as a series of 6 zines. I had previously written a book about the Golden Girls, and I knew I wanted to do another project that involved a TV show, and Star Trek is probably the TV show I'm most passionate about. I really want to talk about Star Trek. But at the same time, I wanted to tell a story where the author didn't realize that they were saying something without realizing it, that they were telling a story like in subtext. The sort of inspiration for that is I was thinking about the Kurt Vonnegut novel Cat's Cradle. There's a character who's a professional indexer, and they're on a plane and they're reading someone else's index. This author who's done their own index on a book, and you can tell by reading the index that this author is a closeted homosexual, just by the way they've indexed their book. All the things, just basically things they've said without realizing they're saying it. And I wanted to do something like that. And the way I decided to do that was to write about all the aliens of Star Trek, Next Generation, but from the perspective of an 11-year-old, specifically an 11-year-old who did not have a very happy home life. And in the process of talking about the aliens, basically couldn't help but talk about all the other things that were going on in his life. Specifically, just sort of him not getting the love and support that he needed from his mom. So I did one issue of those for the first season. And then a lot of people liked it. So I decided to do a second season. For the second season, I moved it forward a year in the author's life, because the first book was written as if it was actually written by an 11-year-old in the year 1990. So the second issue was season 2, written by a 12-year-old in 91, and so on and so forth. And I did 6 total issues, where by the end, the author is a very, very angry teenager grousing about how lazy the makeup artists on Star Trek are, because, just another alien with ridges on their forehead. What is this? This is nonsense.
Yeah, reading this book, I honestly didn't know what to expect, because I didn't know much about it starting to read it. And the voice of the author is, I think, a lot of fun to begin with. It's really interesting. And then it pulls you into this story of the darkness that's in his life and what's going on. And it does a really good job of really grabbing you and making you feel for this person. And, the shift is very subtle to begin with. And I think it's definitely a very interesting take.
Thank you. My hope is that it will be the funniest, saddest, weirdest Star Trek book that anyone ever reads.
Yeah, I would say that probably is true for me. So I'll just let you know.
Yes.
I started reading this at work, and I had to close my office door because I was laughing too hard. And I knew somebody's going to come and go, "What are you laughing about?" And I wasn't going to show them. But it's so hilarious the way it starts off. And I had to message Dan and say, "You've got to read this soon, because it's hilarious." But and I think we'll touch on some of those here in a moment. But then what starts to happen is it becomes less and less funny. Still some funny things in there, but it starts to become pretty dark. And it's like, it just really started to make me feel bad for this kid. And I just like, oh my gosh, how's this going to end? And this really is a field guide to the aliens of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That's totally what it is. You can go in and you're reading it, what each of these aliens are from a perspective of this kid, but you're also learning about what he's going through in his life. And each year he becomes even more rough. Just the way he describes things becomes just even more angry. And I was just not expecting this at all. So I was blown away.
Thank you. That means a lot. Thank you. Exactly what I was hoping for.
Oh, perfect. Well, you've definitely achieved that. And I think something that jumped out to me about this book that was really interesting was, 7 years is a long time in the life of a kid. And the period that this covers, I think basically grade 5 to grade 12, of this kid's life. It's
12, yeah.
7 to 12. And it's amazing, how much of his life that this series has impacted. And it made me think of, my life as a fan and where I was watching these episodes and, the experiences of other people and what other people get out of, the media they consume and that sort of thing. It really raised a lot of those questions, and, that this provided an outlet for this person, the protagonist of the story, for lack of a better term. It was a really interesting way to approach that story.
I will say my mom is great. The mom in this book is not my mom, but this book is very, very autobiographical. There's a lot of details of the Joshua Chapman, who is the author of the book. His life are taken from my life. And, I think having Star Trek save your life is a pretty common experience for people, at least people who are listening to this podcast. It's something I think a lot of us can relate to. And I just want to sort of convey what that was like for me.
So Joshua's opinion of Betazoids, it would be a reflection of your opinion on Betazoids.
When I was 11, yes.
Okay, so let's read an excerpt here. I'm going to read about Betazoids real quick. So it says, and this is from the perspective of Joshua, who's 11 years old. We don't get to see these aliens too much, other than Counselor Troy and her mom, or find out a lot about them. They have naked weddings, I guess, which seems like a bad idea. If I was getting married in a Betazoid wedding, I would be really worried because everyone would be looking at me. But there would be lots of naked women there, and I might get an erection. It is like an even worse version of the nightmare where you're in school in your underpants. The big deal with Betazoids is that they are psychic, which seems like it would make them cool, but they are mostly just annoying. Counselor Troy is half Betazoid, which means that she can sense emotions, but mostly she just says things that they know already, plus she's really weak and spends a lot of time looking like she has a headache, which, yeah, she does. Half the time it is like she is about to start crying, and I don't know how the other people on the ship can deal with it. Her mom is full Betazoid, and she is really annoying and pushy. There might be other Betazoids out there who are not annoying, and use their powers in interesting ways, but if so, we don't see them. That's your description of the Betazoids in this book.
Yes.
Yeah, that was excellent. And, I think, like you say, echoing a lot of the feelings that a lot of Trek fans might have had reading or watching these episodes. And I love the way you kind of delve into Data. And a lot of Star Trek fans really love Data. And in this book, it's kind of taken to an extreme in this particular person who, wants to live without emotion and doesn't see any purpose for them because they just cause pain and that sort of thing. But I feel like that echoes the experiences of a lot of kids growing up who, say things and get angry and face a lot of situations that they don't understand. And if they didn't cry about it, things would be easier and that sort of thing. That part really spoke to me. I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely like how I felt growing up. But just like the day, like, oh, it'd be so great. And even sometimes as an adult, life would just be a lot easier if, like, I could like flip those emotions off. They get pretty pesky sometimes, but I have as an adult type person, I've learned to appreciate Troy a lot more, and learned to see the wisdom. Like, emotions are occasionally useful too.
Excellent. Well, I think I have to say a lot of my favorite parts had to be where, there was an alien race or a character who was being, I guess, abusive would be the right word, or somebody who was taking advantage of someone or gaslighting them. And the voice of this character of the protagonist, of the author, it's really unique to me because he made me see a lot of things in those episodes that I hadn't necessarily seen the first time around. So I think, like, even as someone who would consider himself an uber Star Trek fan and knows everything about the series backwards and forwards, the perspective this brings, I think, is more than enough reason to pick up this book for any Star Trek fan out there, because it really does offer this really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I've definitely, like, writing this book I basically rewatched the entire series for the 11 billionth time and like watched it from a new angle, and it did give me like the new appreciation for just basically sort of how human centric the Federation is, or human exceptionalist. Even starting from the very beginning of the show, where Q is putting humanity on trial, but half the people he's putting on trial are not humans; they're androids and Klingons and Betazoids. It made me realize, sort of like, it really hit home for me that Star Trek is a show about a utopian society that is written by very flawed people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the one that jumped out at me that I had never considered, and it's kind of just a throwaway line in the episode, but in the episode Gambit, when the alien is talking about Picard fighting a bunch of people, and this person who is not human says Picard was fighting a group of aliens, and the author points out, well, wouldn't Picard be an alien to this guy too? Why wouldn't he refer to him as that? I just, stuff like that really made me stop and go, hey, you're right.
Yeah, or even the Traveler. The Traveler manipulates warp fields with his mind because he's got big fat fingers and he must be clumsy, so he has to do things with his head, you know.
Right. I have to say, like, it's definitely like changed how I still view Star Trek, or I watch Star Trek, you know, going forward. I remember watching the season premiere, or the second episode of Discovery, where they are, you know, rigging the Klingon corpses floating in space with explosives. I'm like, wait a second, that's a violation of the Geneva Convention. They're desecrating corpses on the battlefield and rigging them with bombs. That's totally a crime of war, or war crime.
That's true. See, it's like, it's really watching the series. You know, I think we think these things sometimes when we watch the show, but it's like we just don't consciously always remember it or write it down. But then going back, like you said, and watching the episodes and trying to do it from a perspective of a kid, and maybe as yourself, as like pretending you're, you know, when you were that age, you start to notice those things that, like, yeah, why would they say they're aliens if Picard's an alien to them too, and just all those things, you know? I mean, that's what makes it great. And then it's presented like a zine, and the fact that the first chapter or the first season is all handwritten and pictures are pasted on there, and then we get to the next season or chapter, and you can tell it looks like maybe it was done on a typewriter and stuff. So it does look like a collection of zines from the 90s that you just like published and put all together in one book, and I thought that was great.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time crafting the look of, you know, so the first issue is done in my very, very bad cursive writing, so I give you a lot of credit for being able to even read that Betazoid entry out loud. The second one is done like a dot matrix printer. I think the third through fifth ones, what I did is I went back and looked at my report cards from that time period to see what font the computers at my high school were using. And then all the photos in the book, because they wouldn't have memory alpha back then, or the author wouldn't. I took basically Polaroids of Star Trek episodes on my TV, and I put those on the photocopier so that they would be just as bad as, you know, the author would have had them be in 1991.
Excellent. And yeah, that feeling really comes across, like a lot of the visual effects. Like I think the entry for the Iconians shows the Iconian probe on the view screen, and it's all, you know, very washed out because it's this bright image on a screen. And, you know, that kind of realism that it lends to that is really cool. So
yeah, I've always gone for as much authenticity as I can in any of the stuff I've written, or how I craft them, I guess.
So Zachary, you know, I read this one entry about the Antikins and how they look like dogs, and it reminds Joshua of his cat. Does your cat lick your hair like Joshua's cats lick his? And is it soothing for you?
The cat that I had at the time, the cat that I had when I wrote this, that was based on Linus, my cat. Linus is no longer with us, but yes, but yeah, no, that was based on Linus, and it was great. You know, whenever I was feeling down, I'd just lay in bed and he would come lick on my head for a while. I'm like, all right, this feels pretty good.
Well, you've written a really interesting, really incredible book here, and you know, for any Star Trek fans out there that are interested in picking this up, I urge you to do so. It's a very interesting read. You've put together a really cool story here. Where, if people want to grab this, where will they be able to purchase it?
They can purchase it, of course, from Amazon, from Barnes Noble, not so much Barnes Noble. They're kind of bad about this. Powell's.com. They're great. Or from the publisher themselves, which is Devastator Press.
Excellent.
But safest bet is probably Amazon.
Yeah, that's where I grabbed my copy. I grabbed the ebook copy, and it's very faithfully reproduced. It looks really good here. And yeah, I definitely recommend anybody who is interested should grab this because it's really cool.
Can I mention my other book real quick, my non-Star Trek book?
Oh, please, yeah.
My other book that's out right now is How to Talk to Your Cat About Gun Safety, also available pretty much everywhere.
I did see that when I picked this up, and I have to say that the title really is really fascinating. I'm really curious about that one. I might have to grab it.
Yeah, the title definitely sells a lot of copies of that book.
Excellent. Well, if people want to follow you online and kind of keep up with what you're up to, do you have Twitter or anything that people can follow you on?
Yeah, my website is ZacharyAuburn.com. It is ZacharyAuburn.com. Or my Twitter is Robot Unicorn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about the field guide to the aliens of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Definitely a really cool experience.
Yeah, and we really enjoyed it, and thank you for putting that book together because it was fun and also sad in a way. And anybody that's listening needs to check this book out to really appreciate what it is we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Well, today we are talking about a novel that has long been one of my favorites, and that, of course, is A Stitch in Time by the man who played Garak himself, Andrew J. Robinson. So, to start with, and also I should mention we have a guest joining us today, not Andrew Robinson, but the next best thing, Justin Oser. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here. That's a lot to live up to be the next best thing to Andrew Robinson.
Well, it's earned, I think, for sure.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You look just like him.
Sure. Yeah. What the listeners cannot see is that I put on my Cardassian makeup so that I look like Garak. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on the show again. We love having you aboard, and especially to talk about this novel, which, as I said, is one of my favorites. I'm not sure how you guys feel about it, but curious to find that out. First of all, I want to hear from you guys. How did you first read this book? Is this your first time reading it, or is this one that's been on your shelf for a while?
Justin, you're the guest. You should go first.
Okay.
There you go.
This is my second time reading it. The first time was about a year ago. So,
wow.
So,
this is my second time reading it, and my first time was probably this book came out at what,
2001, I think? 2000,
yeah.
So I read it sometime, maybe a year after that. It hadn't been out all that long.
Yeah, my experience is very similar to that. This is my second time reading it, but I read it way back shortly after it first came out. I don't think I grabbed it off the shelf and whipped through it in like the month of release, but I think it was about a year and a half after that. But I read through this one after hearing all the buzz around it because a lot of people really, really love this novel. A lot of people have gone on the record saying this is, if not their favorite Trek novel, definitely up there. And anytime you're on like the Trek BBS, you see the top 10 lists that people do. This one is a frequent appearance on those lists. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see if it lives up to that.
I'm looking at the inside cover. It was May 2000 when it was first published.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar, Dan, because I kept hearing all the buzz. I was going to read eventually, but it was like, it's so good, it's so good, it's so good. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to read this book. And so later I did.
Yeah, before I really heard the buzz about it, I actually saw it at a thrift store for like $1. And I looked at the back cover and I was like, oh, it's a really long letter. I don't know if that'll be any good. And I didn't get it at the time. This was a couple years ago. And then I heard all the buzz about it and I went back. Of course, it wasn't at the thrift store anymore. And as people might know, this is a book that can be very expensive as a physical book because it's been out of print for a long time. It's very sought after. So I have this as an ebook because it was just too expensive for me to get the physical book at this point.
Yeah, that's a good question to ask you guys as well. I have this as a physical copy. Like I said, I bought it way back when. And It's in surprisingly good shape, I notice, for books that I have from that period that I read. Usually there's some kind of wear and tear on it, but this one's held up pretty well. Bruce, you read the physical copy as well, I'm assuming?
Yes, I have it right here in front of me.
That's a very valuable commodity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, if anybody's interested, I'll sell it to you for $1,000.
No, seriously, on Amazon, I think the lowest used book was like $90 last time I saw it.
Wow.
There are other places where you can get it for less, but I haven't seen anybody get it for less than like $20 or $30 lately. It's pretty sought after.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. Because I think they did, the initial printing and maybe a bit after that, but I think it's been out of print for at least 15 years, something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, physically, it's I love, like, let's start by judging it by its cover, I guess. I love the artwork on this cover. It's simple, but gorgeous. And I mean, I guess it's fitting for plain simple Garak, but it's just Garak standing, holding an orchid, presumably one of these Edosian orchids that we hear about frequently in the book, in kind of, I'm guessing, the ruins of Cardassia. And he's got this very thoughtful look on his face, kind of, to quote Geordie referring to Cochrane's statues, sort of looking towards the future or something like that. I love this cover.
It's pretty great, yeah.
Yeah, but that's just one version of the cover. There's, I think, a German cover that's totally different. And it's got more of a close-up shot of Garak and then stars or whatever in the background. So it's a very different one. But it's more in line with a lot of those covers that you've seen of the German versions of the novels.
Those German covers, they're beautiful. I feel like I like the American covers that we get, but there's just something like extra special about those, isn't there?
Yeah,
I think so.
There's something to them. I think this is one of the few instances where I prefer the American one over the German one. But lately, sorry to say this, pocketbooks, lately, yeah, from the more recent releases, I really like the German covers a lot more. Anyway, so coming back to A Stitch in Time, this is a very unique novel, not only in the fact that it's written by the actor that played the character, it's also in a format very different to most typical Star Trek novels. And Justin, you alluded to this a little earlier. It's kind of a series of journal entries or letters to Bashir in Garak's voice. And it's his own history, his kind of... We recently read the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard. This is kind of similar. It's kind of Garak's autobiography, or at least his memoirs. And we got 3 different stories, 3 tracks running through. We've got Garak's history in the form of journal entries from his time as a young man, going to school on Cardassia, through his career and ending up aboard Terok Nor and then Deep Space Nine. And then we have some of his time aboard Deep Space Nine in the last year of the Dominion War. And then we get the quote-unquote present on Cardassia Prime during the reconstruction following the defeat of the Dominion. So what did you guys think, first of all, of the format of this book and how it was presented?
I like the format a lot, and I think that, what does make it unusual, it's not the only time we've seen one of the actors that played a character write a book, because there's Left Hand of Destiny that J.G. Hertzler co-wrote, but it's an unusual thing, and to see it as like this autobiography of a recurring character, I think that Garak is one of those characters that is so memorable and so mysterious and interesting that can hold your interest. And I like that it was from his perspective, because on the show, on Deep Space Nine, we got to see, little bits, but for the most part, it was really from the perspective of whatever story was being told, and he was an element of that. He wasn't necessarily, it wasn't something that was told from his point of view specifically. So to see that was really interesting, and to get his thoughts and to see his evolution, because along those 3 tracks, as you follow them going back and forth, you see how he started as, a child or more naive, and the education he gets, and he learns more and more. And by the time you see him in the post-war era, he has all of this wisdom that he's gathered and all of these ways that he's changed. And I like that format and kind of showing his progression through his life.
I like how the book was laid out with these 3 different scenarios, these 3 tracks going on. If it is on the station, it's an entry that is a different typeface than the entries of what happened in the past on Cardassia Prime. And then when you would get to another section, there's nothing that would say entry, and then you knew that that was in the present of his return to Cardassia Prime. So it wasn't confusing to say, okay, which track am I on? Because first of all, the different fonts between one and the 2 others, and then the fact that it would say entry at the beginning of 2 of them and not the other one. So I really liked how that was laid out and how they were interwoven with each other. So it flowed very well. It could get really confusing when you have 3 different stories going on at different time periods, but I did not have a single problem with that at all.
Well, you guys read the physical book and I read the ebook. There is not a different font between those. So I did get a bit tripped up or confused sometimes to see where I was. Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah, because I can see that would be a problem. Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Yeah. I'm trying to imagine that experience of reading that without that visual cue.
It's fine most of the time, but there's like a small percentage of the time where it's like, okay, where am I now? But then as you see the characters that are involved or how he's talking about it, you can get into it within a page or 2. But sometimes it was a bit confusing.
Well, then maybe it's worth the $99 to get the physical book just for that reason.
There you go.
Well, I've told I love this novel. It's one of my favorites. I've told people that, if the physical book is the only option, it's worth whatever they can pay for it. So you heard that from me.
That's definitely high praise. Excellent. Yeah, that 3 tracks and like you say, that font system of differentiating that was really helpful. And I suppose, I wonder, like, when he's in his mind and kind of introspective at the start of one of those chapters, it probably would have taken a little longer to figure out exactly where he was because, there aren't those clues. That might have been, I have to imagine, because they had the font choice, it wasn't written with that in mind that there would have to be some kind of clue there. So that might have been a little frustrating at times.
Yeah, no, I mean, it didn't really take away from it. It was just a bit confusing at times.
Yeah, because we know when we go into that next entry, we know exactly where we are because that font change. Where Justin, you would probably 2-3 paragraphs in sometimes, and you're still trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah, and I had expected almost something like what you see sometimes, where at the top of the chapter it'll have the year. Or in the case of something like Q squared, where it's track A, track B, track C, and you'll be able to see where you're going back and forth. So, I mean, a little bit, but I don't think it took away from it too much. I had no idea that it was supposed to be a different font in the physical book, never having read it that way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. The thing I'd like to do with this book is, of course, I mentioned I read it, 16 years ago. So I don't remember that much about it. So reading it this time, now I wish I would have gone back to the beginning and read it, just the beginning part again, because I knew that he was giving these entries to Julian Bashir. But at first I'm just like, okay, really? He's just going to give him these entries and divulge all these secrets about himself to Julian. But now that I've read it and how deep it is, it's like, wow, it would really take a lot of meaning for him to do such a thing for Julian. And I really wanted to go back and read the beginning as to why he felt compelled to do that. I mean, I know he says why, but I mean, there's really got to be a deep reason behind that.
Yeah, and he goes into that in the end as well, why he's doing it.
I don't know, the bond between Bashir and Garak is something that I find really fascinating. And I like that, like you said, he goes into that a little bit as to why he was initially kind of drawn to this person so early on. And talking about, the one thing that popped into my mind was how Garak views Bashir. Like, humans are just humans, but Bashir, because he's genetically engineered, and he didn't even know that at the time, he just recognized that there's something different about this guy, and he's more like a Cardassian. And I don't know how Bashir would feel about that, but we know what that means to Garak, which is really interesting.
Well, and this book really cements that relationship because we learn that he's never really had a relationship like this with anyone else. And anytime he's had a relationship where he grows close to someone, it doesn't play out well in the end. But it has continued to play out well with Julian. I think that's the one person in his life that he can look on and say, that's the only one that I've been able to trust and have true friendship with. And now I'm ready to cement that friendship by exposing everything about myself to him.
And you know what struck me as well was that in this book, and I don't think we've known that or it's been said before, I think Garak told Bashir like everything about what happened in the episode in the Pale Moonlight, which I don't think he has really told anyone else or Sisko had told anyone else. So that's a big thing to tell him that kind of deep, dark secret, you know?
Well, I noticed even like within the journal entries, he chronicled himself talking to Bashir about what had happened in that episode. And like very shortly after it had happened. And I mean, the book does an excellent job with Star Trek, you know, the C word, canon, you know, and like it does very good. But that part I was like, I don't know if that would have been, you know, it almost seems like it was common knowledge and Bashir's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, Bashir was involved because Sisko was asking him for this biomimetic gel, which was super suspicious, right? So there was some way that Bashir knew something funny was going on. And I could definitely see him, you know, maybe going to Garak if he pieced things together that Garak was involved and trying to find out. So I could kind of see that because he had some piece of it already. Like, why would Sisko ask me for, you know, this stuff that he's not supposed to be giving out?
Yeah. I almost feel, though, that like if Bashir learned it was to pay off this guy to create a fake thing and he's already a criminal, like he would have even had a bigger problem with that. But anyway, but yeah, no, it kind of all fits together a bit.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the background information on this book too, because, you know, why would Andrew Robinson write a Garak book? And apparently, from what I've read, research on this is that he was keeping a diary of his character on the set and was bringing this to conventions. And David R. George III, who's a Star Trek author, saw this book or some of these writings from Andrew and said, you know, this is really good. You should gather all this up and share it with Pocket and maybe have it printed as a book. Well, he did, and the rest is history. So that's how this came about.
And I love, like, we've talked to David R. George about this book in particular in the past and how Andrew Robinson was kind of like, oh, I should take it to an author and get them to be a co-author on this. And maybe David R. George, you could do that. And apparently he looked at it and said to Andrew Robinson's like, yeah, you don't need me. There you go. You're good. So high praise from a prolific published author too.
Absolutely. And I don't even know if Andrew Robinson has written any other books. Do you guys know off the top of your head?
Not Star Trek books. That's for sure.
Right. But any other books, do you know? I mean, I don't.
Not that I know of, but I haven't looked into it.
I mean, it almost felt like he had all of this stuff that he had gathered together about Garak, and he constructed this life story, and it's kind of like, I'm done. I did what I wanted to do, you know? But I don't know if he's done anything, you know, in any other genre or other sci-fi thing. I don't know.
Well, if he hasn't, you would think that this might inspire him to write another book, you know, not necessarily a Star Trek book, but yeah, just any book. Anyway, we'll have to find that out. If anybody knows, they can send us an email or a tweet or whatever.
Definitely. All the myriad of ways to get in contact with us for sure. Well, jumping to the beginning of this book, you know, we talk about how Garak doesn't have any of these close friendship relations like he does with Bashir, and you know, most of the ones he has had have gone wrong. And the period in your life where you make great friendships and stuff is, you know, as a young person going to school. And we see Garak's experience with that when he, as a young man, goes to the Bamaran Institute for State Intelligence. And so, you know, while human young people are forming relationships and learning what it means to be a human being. He's being schooled in fighting in the pit and doing like treks across the wilderness to sneak past sentries and that kind of thing. And so we see this part in his life. He ranks 10 in his group, and through his time there, he proves that he deserves to be ranked higher. And we see this very interesting relationship with Enabrin Tain, who of course will have a huge part in Garak's life. And, contrasting that a bit with the relationship that he has with his father, Tolan, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then how that leads to his career in the Obsidian Order. What did you guys think of his early years at this institute?
So my favorite parts of the book are the early years and the later years. The middle years, I mean, they're interesting, but they're not my favorite. So actually, the later years are probably my most favorite, followed by, closely behind by the early years of him growing up. And we don't really see him necessarily as a little kid. It's just, in his, when he's a little older and in this institute. I found it to be really interesting just to see the dynamics of how the school works and how they train them and how they have these groups with the order of 1 through 10 and how they play off of each other and the tests and things that they have to deal with. That definitely shapes what we know of Garak and Cardassia as a whole and what they're really all about.
Yeah, and I mean, you were saying before, Dan, that for humans as a child, they're learning what it means to be a human being. I feel like in this education, Garak is learning what it means to be a Cardassian being, because for them, service to the state is the highest thing that you can do, and it's kind of an honor to go to an institute like this and to prepare for that. And everything that they're doing is really preparing them for a couple of different things, I guess, either being part of the military or being part of the Obsidian Order or serving the state in some other way. So it's kind of like this, they're getting here a trial run into what I guess Cardassians would see as like the combat of life, right? Against your enemies, whoever they are, whether they're right in front of you or they're subtle or whatever the case is. It's preparing you for competition and combat. And that's kind of, I think, what his education means to him and how it shapes him and how we see it affect him. I mean, I think that kind of training really kind of does a disservice and scars him at a certain point, and he has to recover from that. So it's really fascinating to see this and what it means to grow up as a Cardassian, because I think this is the first time that we've seen something like that, what it means to really like be a Cardassian and be raised in that kind of society.
And we know Cardassia is that kind of totalitarian, always put the state first, always for the good of the nation. And we see that played out in this institute. I mean, it's got a very 1984 vibe to it, like when he, for example, he has to go get cleaning supplies and he can pick whoever he wants. And he's like, well, it's just getting cleaning supplies. I can do that myself. And I don't know if I want to ask anybody. I'll just go myself. And he goes to do it. And of course, he's interrogated basically on the spot.
Too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He's beaten and interrogated and like, why didn't you take anybody else? Why did you come alone? And it's just, the quote education that he's given is terrifying. And it was honestly, like, I think when I read this back like in 2000, I would have just graduated high school. And so, I think I remember kind of putting myself in his place and thinking like, oh, that's kind of messed up. But now looking back on it, having been a high school teacher and seeing it from that side, I'm just like, this is so damaging. Like, oh my God.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole point of that scene or that lesson is that you always have to remember to work with the group and with whoever you can in order to accomplish your goals. So they, literally like beat that into his head. And just like from a pretty young age, he's learning that you have to serve the state. What you want doesn't matter. It's what the people who are your superiors and your teachers want and what the state and the leadership wants that's important. I mean, there's nothing about his own real wants or goals that's important, and it's kind of frightening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so during his time at the school here, we also get an introduction to what turns out to be one of his most important relationships in his life, and this is the young Cardassian woman who's a year ahead of him. I believe 1 year ahead of him. Palandine, I think, is how I pronounced her name while reading it. What did you guys think of this character and kind of her role in Garak's early life here, and specifically just in the early years? Because we'll definitely get to there's more of her to come for sure.
Well, because the fact that we know that he hasn't had that many relationships, to see him bonding with a woman that he then has feelings for is quite interesting. And I was very suspicious of her from the very beginning, if she was up to something, because it seems that all Cardassians are always up to something.
I think everybody at that institute has a hidden agenda, and is
Absolutely.
trying to crawl all over everybody else to get to the top.
Even Garak himself. I mean, they all do. I mean, it's amazing that they even get along. Any of them, But she just kind of, I don't know why she singled him out. I mean, I do kind of find out later why she does, but it just seems like she just randomly picked him as somebody that she wanted to bond with.
Well,
not bond like in a physical way.
No, but I mean, it seems like there's like two levels that are going on with her. I think at one level, I take it at face value that she really is kind of looking for someone to be friendly with or is attracted to him. But at another level, she can use that for her own advancement or to keep an eye on what's going on with him, because I think he catches her eye as someone who's supposed to be lower rated, right, as 10th in his group, but that there's something there. There's some kind of like brilliance that's there that she needs to keep track of, right? And in some way kind of, control or find a way to her advantage. So I think she sees something in him that others might not.
It's kind of interesting that we bring up what all of their individual agendas are. Like right off the bat, for example, they're at the Institute for State Intelligence, and basically just by putting him off guard, she is able to get so much information out of him in just that initial encounter. I was just like, Garak, what are you doing? But at the same time, like it really illustrated to me that, one of the lessons they're trying to literally beat into these people is that, it's all about the group. You're for the group. Everything you do is a reflection on the group. And yet everybody has such individual agendas, and they're all just crawling all over one another to get ahead. And I just, that those two forces at work are just, it would drive me insane to be there.
Yeah. Could it be, I hadn't had this thought before, but could it be in some way that, that this was some kind of test for Garak? And that somehow, I don't know if this makes any sense, but that somehow, someone had convinced her to take an interest in him, because it seems like Tain in a lot of ways is looking to test him and see if he's really worthy. And in the end, he kind of fails the test. But I don't know, because with the Cardassians, you can't tell like how elaborate their plan really is, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she had a plan and she was using him as we know that happens later in the story. But I had those thoughts initially that, okay, she's been set up to go seek him out. She's working for Tain or something like that or whatever. But that doesn't prove out to be true. But I think, Justin, you were right initially about how she just saw something in him. And based on what you were saying and then Dan was saying after that, it dawned on me that when she seeks him out and she sees something about him and she wants to start this friendship with him, it's almost a parallel and a mirror of what we see of Garak with Bashir. It's almost like Garak has become the Palpatine. See, I almost want to say... Oh, wait, Star Wars, that's a whole other thing. Paladine, and mirroring that, what she did with him, he's now doing with Bashir.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definite parallels all over this story with what we know of his character later on. And going back to something that was said earlier, I actually initially, it had been long enough since I read this book, of course, that I couldn't remember exactly what role everybody plays and what ends up happening. So I was initially thinking like, okay, so she's in the year ahead of him. It's a Institute for State Intelligence. Her assignment is to learn everything about this guy. And at the same time, if he gives up everything, he's failing some hidden assignment as well. And so I was thinking along those lines, like this is all perfectly tightly controlled by the overseers kind of thing. And they're being observed at all times and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I hadn't even thought as far as Tane being involved or anything like that. I just thought it was a school thing. But yeah, we learned that there are plans within plans and there are agendas that aren't immediately revealed for sure.
And even, you know, when you're just kind of as part of this institute, I guess maybe as a teenager, you have to like keep on your guard the whole time. And if there are lapses, it can lead to some serious problems for you. Or yeah, I mean, I think at one point they say before he gets sent to the institute, like, your childhood's over now, you know. It's you're here to serve the state now, and you know, be vigilant. So like from a really young age,
because you're not even supposed to refer to your name. I mean, you're giving a designation, and you can't even call yourself Garak or whatever your real name is.
Yeah, because as far as the state is concerned, you are a ranking within a group. That's it.
Yeah, you've lost your individuality.
Yeah.
Even though everybody has their own individual agenda, but we're all supposed to work as a group. It's so confusing.
Yeah, I tell you, I would just absolutely lose my mind at this point.
Yeah, I mean, but we're seeing that also from a human perspective. But like, if you had grown up in that kind of society where that was a normal thing for generations and generations, you would just see it as this is just what we do, you know. But it's hard to put ourselves in that position.
It is, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a theme that's going to come and play a big role in the end of the book when we see that, you know, generation after generation, this is the same thing. And where has it gotten us? You know, us being Cardassia. I don't know. I guess the book, because it's written in the first person, I'm really getting into
Teen Garak.
But yeah, exactly. So while at the Institute, of course, Garak does distinguish himself. And he kind of learns this skill to be hidden from people around him and kind of shrink away and minimize himself so that he's unnoticed. And one of their assignments, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was to make their way through this wilderness. They play the role of the hunter and the hunted at various times. And Garak gets really good at being the hunted in that he makes it all the way back to home base, I guess, without being discovered. And he becomes really well known for this, which gives him kind of some notoriety and a place of leadership in what's called the competition. And it's just the competition with a capital C. And this has, I think, it's this one event that has ripples that go out across Garak's life based on what happens in this event. What did you guys think of this singular event in Garak's life and the role that he played there?
I don't know.
Well, no, I actually had a thought about something you're talking about before, like his technique to kind of disappear and become kind of invisible. I thought that was just fascinating to read about, and the thought that you could kind of train yourself to blend into the background. I mean, there's one point at which basically he's, you know, sitting on his bed studying. His roommates come in. They don't realize that he's there. They start talking about, you know, getting into his personal stuff. And then he scares the heck out of them because they didn't realize he was there. I'm just thinking, wow, that's a really amazing skill to have. And I love that he learns that skill from an animal that he sees out in the wilderness. What they call it, a regnar? Is that how you pronounce it?
Regnar, yeah.
And so, and one of the, as I think about it, one of the themes that I see is kind of there's this connection that Garak has to contemporary society, but there's also the connection to the natural world or what came before with this animal, with the gardening that he likes to do. So I see it sometimes as there's kind of, he's wanting to get back to something like simpler or of a previous time. And I like that a lot. But like for the competition, I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing because there are these two sides, and who knows who works for what side, and they have to get past this goal, and and there's some real consequences. People get like really seriously injured, and I mean they're still, I guess, teenagers at this point, and I don't know, just this whole competition feels kind of brutal.
It does. It reminds me of the Hunger Games in a sense. I mean, not that they're all killing each other, but just that they're out there and they're hiding but yeah, the thing with the animal was really strange that, he can learn from this animal just to hide himself, and he even takes the animal with him and locks it away, and he's like kept it almost like a pet for a long period of time. And I guess he had to feed it. I mean, I don't know. Did he have to clean the cage every time it I mean, I don't know how he was really taking care of this thing.
I guess so. But like I almost, like as I was reading it and the way that it's being described, it almost seemed like it was a spiritual experience for Garak, getting to know this animal and having it put him into touch and harmony with things around him. And that's another thread that runs through is kind of like a certain spiritual journey for Garak, which I think is totally unexpected because, from what we see in Deep Space Nine, spirituality is just not important for Cardassian society or for Garak, but it's an interesting thread that comes through that I think the first time I read it, I was surprised that it was there, but there's like this other side that's like spiritual or more kind of in contact with nature or a simpler time that's very interesting to me.
I could be totally off about this. I could be totally wrong, but to me that felt like, a lot of what we see in this book comes from the writers of Deep Space Nine and their crafting of Garak and what they put into him. And of course, the voice that Andrew Robinson brought to the screen. And wow, does that ever come across on the pages here? Like it's just 3 words in, I'm hearing Andrew Robinson's voice in my head, which is incredible. But the spirituality side of it and some of that stuff, I'm thinking it feels to me like that's a lot of Andrew Robinson bringing more of himself into the character than what was there in the scripts on Deep Space Nine. And like I say, I could be totally wrong about that, but it feels like a lot of this is a very personal philosophy for Andrew Robinson.
That's a possibility. I mean, but I also see it as what we actually saw on the episodes on Deep Space Nine were a certain slice of his life and his outlook for those 7 years, and that there were other things that were going on that he was affected by before and afterwards. But that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it as Andrew Robinson's kind of personal stamp or personal philosophy or
yeah, and like I say, that could be totally off. I have no idea what. I met the man for about 10 minutes at the Vegas Trek convention.
Did you have a feeling of peace at the time?
I had the feeling that I was sitting across from a very intelligent man. Like I feel like this guy could talk about anything and sound learned. He's a really cool guy.
And he's anyway. And I learned everything that I know from an animal that I captured and found. But yeah, and it does come across to me, from what we talked about earlier, the background of the writing of this book, that, as he's on the set and he's reading these scripts, he's just putting backstories to everything he's given. And I just wonder if there was conversations with the writers about his character, and some of these ideas came from them that we didn't see on the page of the script that he incorporated into these stories, or just that discussion with them, these things start to come out. And he really obviously loved and owned this character if he's going to put the time into writing these backstories. It's brilliant that he took that time and effort to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
And he did write other books.
Oh, he did?
I looked it up.
Oh,
I'm on Goodreads
excellent.
here. He wrote Lexa and the Smugglers of Cyclo, and Lexa and the Gordian Maze of Terra. But he also contributed to Prophecy and Change,
that's right.
the Deep Space Nine.
Oh,
which I never
forgot
read.
about
I
that.
haven't read that,
right.
but I do remember reading that he did a short story as a kind of a follow-up to this, right?
I think so.
I think so. Yeah.
We'll have.
I've
Let's go read
I've
it.
got that book in a box.
Yeah, it's a
somewhere.
short story.
I
We'll
should
we'll be
dig
back
that
in 20 minutes.
Excellent. Well, in this book also, kind of jumping ahead a bit, we follow Garak's career in the Obsidian Order. And, you know, I don't want to dwell too much on this because, you know, this like we could talk about this book, I think, for hours.
Definitely.
And as much fun as that would be and as great as that would be, we should probably not do that. But we learn, to me, what's really interesting is the ultimate reason why he was exiled to Terok Nor and sent away. What did you guys think of that whole aspect of the story? And was it what you expected, I guess? Because I think we get several stories during the series. And of course, they all come from Garak, so they're all suspect. I think he tells Odo at one time that it was tax fraud or something like that, or being late on his taxes or something like that. And I think he might have, I might be making this up. This might have been something in my head, but he, you know, messed up somebody's suit he was making or something like that. You know, like he just always kind of brushed it off and gave a glib answer. And here, supposedly, we get the real reason.
Well, see, that's it. I didn't really have an expectation because I couldn't ever believe, and I don't know what the real reason is that he ended up there. So I didn't really go in and read this and think if this was meeting an expectation that I had, because I don't think I went in with that. If anything, there's a lot about this book that I don't even remember from the first time reading it, which I think I'll talk about when we close the show, just my different experiences reading this book. But the reason he's on the station makes sense to me. It wasn't far-fetched. It wasn't a stretch or anything to the imagination where I'm like, oh, that's lame, that's stupid. It wasn't anything like that.
Yeah, and so I feel like sometimes there's these three different tracks, and there's so much in the book I have to kind of keep straight what happened. So, the reason wasn't it twofold? It had to do with, you know, this assignment that he has that relates to Ducat's father, right? But then it's kind of like, well, we could maybe get you out of that, but you also have, you know, this relationship with this guy's wife, so we got to get rid of you. I mean, it's kind of twofold, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which, are we in spoilers now?
I think we're firmly in spoilers now. So
because he also, this, you know, the woman that he loves, he kills her husband. And isn't that kind of the event that leads him towards Terok Nor? Isn't that?
It's so, he's kind of assigned by Tane to kill her husband, but at the same time, also he can never see her again.
Right.
And he breaks that rule because he's in love and, you know, he's, you know, letting that rule his,
sentimentality.
His
that's his weakness.
Exactly. And I think Tane says as much both in this book and in an episode of Deep Space Nine as well. I mean, you know, I that's one thing I love, how closely this hews to what we know about Garak in Deep Space Nine. Like, there's a lot of times in novels, and I hate to say this as someone who loves the novels, sometimes you have to squint to make it fit. Like, the author takes some liberty and you're like, okay, I'll just pretend that he actually said this, and that's not really... This novel, there's just so much in here, and it all fits perfectly with Garak's story. Like, it's a companion piece to the series.
Well, and I think it
I'm
benefits a lot from basically, you know, Andrew Robinson writing some of it, like, while the show was in production, you know, it's fresh in his mind, I think, during a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I should also note probably some very good editing as well, because I loved the acknowledgments when he talked about Margaret Clark and the fact that she let him know that Hasperat is a Bajoran dish and not a Cardassian dish, saving him from Trek infamy, which I thought was excellent.
Yeah.
So utilizing your resources very well, just like Garak would, which is good. But yeah, Palandine. So this is, of course, where she is in the story again, and Garak has been carrying on an illicit affair with her, and he's banned from seeing her again, but he keeps seeing her and is ultimately, and it's tied in with Gul Dukat's father, and that whole affair. Different kind of affair. I shouldn't have used the word
incident.
Affair. That whole incident. So he's ultimately exiled to Terok Nor to mend the uniforms of the Cardassian troops garrisoned there. So that's kind of the immediate origin story for Garak, which we get.
Which I often wondered how he became a tailor, and I guess this answers that question. He was just assigned that duty to mend the uniforms, and he had to figure out how to do it. He was not like trained as a tailor growing up.
But he did say before at some point that he had an interest in clothing, and one of his favorite things was to pick out his wardrobe for his mission. So there was, he put in a little bit there from beforehand, but when he actually gets there, he doesn't really know how to do it.
Right, that he has to fix a computer so he can start learning some things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I was a little disappointed. I thought he was going to use that computer for something more than just that.
Like to kill Gul Dukat or something? Try to.
Or attempt to. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of had the same thought. I thought he was up to something a little different there. But I don't think it was trying to kill Gul Dukat, because anything Garak puts his mind to, he just ultimately does. So, but yeah, no, it's really interesting. I liked that aspect too. I wasn't expecting that tailoring wasn't something that he had a passion for to begin with. It was like you said, he had some tangential interest, but he was thrust into that role, and
there was no garden on Terok Nor, so what could he do?
Yeah. And because he's Garak, he's just awesome at whatever he does, and works really hard to be the best
and charge the highest price. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I like how
the whole deal with Quark was great.
Yes, Quark is just like working deals with him as I'll send you business, and then I'll keep a percentage of what business you make from the referrals I sent you and such. And I'll never watch Deep Space Nine the same way again, because anytime I see Quark, I'm going to look at his clothes and think, he got Garak to make that for him. It's like, just because, and I now know the story behind. I mean, I don't know if Garak made all of Quark's clothing that we see on Deep Space Nine, but there's definitely indication here that he was making sure that he and his brother looked very dapper while working.
Well, and I loved that he made Rom's uniform as well. And then Quark charged Rom for it.
Yes.
But it's okay, because Rom's like, it was a fair price. Yeah. It's okay. And Garak's like, oh.
And I like that that Garak is giving this commission to Quark for any business that comes by it. He makes a point of saying Quark always kept his word. And I'm thinking, is Garak the only person to ever say Quark always kept his word?
That's a good call.
Yeah, he definitely seems to have respect for Quark.
Yeah.
Probably more so than anybody else in the station.
Because Quark's a survivor too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, the parallels between, and I hadn't thought of that until reading this book, that those two characters are two people that would have been on the station before most of the cast gets there, kind of together, which is really interesting. Them and Odo.
Yeah, well, I mean, and of course, Quark and Garak, we see them commiserate sometimes about the Federation and how it's insidious and all that stuff. So I think they have kind of a similar perspective in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Speaking of insidious, to me, when the Cardassians withdrew and Garak didn't even know, like, it happened in the night and no one told him, and that's how he is still there. That was, man, that was a teeth gnashing moment. I would have been so angry.
It was kind of the ultimate. I mean, like in a way, after he's disgraced, they're doing two things as an ultimate insult. I mean, first, we're not going to execute you. We're going to exile you to this station where you're just going to be the. I think he says he feels like he's the only Cardassian slave on Terok Nor, so it's like he's the lowest of the low in some ways. Mm-hmm. And then after that, they're not even going to take him with them. He just has to fend for himself, amongst all the Bajorans. So, wow. Yeah, and that's what makes it really interesting, because at that point, he's at the lowest point. They're not even going to take him with them back to Cardassia Prime. But then there is kind of, after the end of the war and the post-war period, he has a very different role, and he kind of redeems himself. And I like that a lot, at least in the eyes of other Cardassians. It's really something. Like the whole arc of the story feels really epic, like all the ups and downs in his life.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things, and this book contributes to it, and I think Una McCormack's novels really contribute to it. Like, there are not a lot of Star Trek alien races that are as fleshed out as the Cardassians are. I mean, there's the Vulcans and the Klingons and the Romulans a little bit, but man, do these novels ever get into Cardassia and Cardassian society. And now, especially with the post-series novels and, after the Dominion War and the Reconstruction period on Cardassia, I think just we learn so much about these people and what they've been through and what the future hopefully holds for them and that kind of thing. So in this novel, we get, a vivid description of the aftermath of the destruction on the homeworld. And, a lot of it is presented initially as statistics and dry facts, like, there's over 1 billion dead on Cardassia, and that's just a number. But we get the experience of Garak, in the trenches with the people of his sector, kind of a Cardassian neighborhood, cleaning up and, doing rescue operations, which eventually turn into burial details once, the time has passed for there to be any survivors left. And it's, this whole period is really fascinating to me. And, I see here, Justin, you put in the notes, the burgeoning democratic movement on Cardassia and how those seeds are kind of sprouting and how Garak's helping them along, kind of gardening in a different way now, creating a new society.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but definitely. I mean, I think, I agree with you, Bruce, that this was my favorite part of the book, was the post-war part. I love the other parts too, but there's something even from the beginning of the book where it starts in the post-war period, and he's talking about all of this dust, not only from the buildings, but I think also from, the people that have died. So it's like you're kind of breathing in all of this death and destruction. So it's like all around him. And then during the course of the book, as we see that along this track, there's a couple of really interesting things that happen. He feels like he has to do something. So he builds these memorials that have like debris that are in different piles, and people see it as memorials to the dead, and they're doing death chants. And so he's starting to kind of get this respect, or this way of kind of moving people through this time. And then as kind of you're going through that and seeing the people he's interacting with, I think one of my favorites that I'm glad that they included is Dr. Parmak, who was mentioned in basically one line in Deep Space Nine, where Garak talked about someone giving up secrets just by staring at them for 4 hours or something like that, right? But he's this friend to Garak now. I guess he's forgiven that, and he's kind of like a Cardassian Bashir, because he's confiding in him certain things, and he's talking with him about where they go from here. And like as you go through it, you see more and more like the two different factions, the people of the old order, and then the people like Parmak and Alan Gamor who want like a new, more democratic order. So I found that part just totally fascinating, thinking about what that post-war period's like, and that there's so much destruction that people eventually decide we've got to do something different. We can't do the same thing because it almost destroyed us.
Yeah, and that's the thing I really love about this part too, is when we see the old guard trying to get back in power again to make things right. And Garak realizes you're the, I mean, he doesn't say it to them, but it's like, you're the ones who put us here. If you get back in power and do your thing all over again, it's just going to bring more destruction again later. We have to be different. We have to do something different to bring Cardassia Prime into its prime and leave it there. And the fact that there's like almost like two schools of philosophy now, the old and new, and they have to come together. And we start to see that the old power starts to realize they can't have the full power they had before, and that those who didn't have power before are starting to have power and influence as a community to come together and make change happen, and the two start to blend and become one. And no one has the ultimate power anymore. And now they can rebuild and be one united society. And I loved that part of the book.
Yeah, that was, I mean, to borrow a phrase, it gave me all the feels. I really like that kind of, that epic sweep of the story, and that idea that this is, a brave new world for Cardassia and stuff. And I love that the kind of cadre of the old guard, it's a little bit small universe syndrome, I guess, but I love that all of them are people that we've seen before. And then even the one person they didn't identify is, someone very important from Garak's past, who actually plays, we haven't talked about him much, but he plays a pretty big role throughout the book. But, and I loved just the little hints that, like, for the readers out there who don't remember who these people are, it's like Gul Madred, who had a pretty good career up until that fiasco where he tortured Picard.
I got kind of like a shiver when I saw Madred was in the novel. I'm like, oh, that guy.
Right? Yeah, like that episode is so dark, but it's crazy to think these were Garak's contemporaries. These were his, not necessarily colleagues, but people that were a part of the society that he was a part of in his prime and stuff, which is, kind of terrifying to think about. The one character they don't drop a hint about is Gul Oset, because they can't really say, oh, and she chased some DNA fragments around for a bit with the Klingons and the Federation. Anyway,
I'd forgotten that's where we saw her. Okay.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like they really wanted to drop a hint about that, but couldn't figure out a way to do it well. But
yeah. Well, I also thought, these people of the old guard, I'm thinking like 1 billion people died and these guys are still around, but...
Oh, I know. I had the same thought.
It could be that, these were the powerful people that, had their avenues or ways of getting away, or staying away from the destruction. But yeah, that part was very interesting. I mean, I think also this other side of it, this kind of democratic movement, there's this, from the other side, from the old guard, they're saying this is Federation corruption. The Federation's coming in. They're trying to help us rebuild. And now they want to, transform our political system. How can they do that? But I think what Andrew Robinson gets across really effectively is that people feel like the old order has so thoroughly destroyed their life and their civilization that they have to at least try. They can't just call it a name like this is something from the Federation and not try it. They have to try it. And if it doesn't work, they can, try something else. But I like that it gets to that spirit. And I think that can happen sometimes when a society has faced a lot of destruction or things have been turned upside down. People can be more willing to try something that they wouldn't before and just see what happens,
Yeah.
Yeah. And thinking back on this book, just as we're talking, I'm realizing how little there is about Bajor and the relationship with Bajor in here. I mean, this really is focused on Cardassia itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. With regards to Cardassia, I kind of like that thought. It's almost as though like, okay, billions have died. Our society's completely destroyed. The military's led us down this path. fine, we'll try something other than totalitarianism. Jeez. No, but you know, a lot of ways, a lot of these people are kind of dragged kicking and screaming into this, you know, trying a new way. But like you said, the popular feeling, the groundswell of the people seems to be to push in this direction.
The people that are left, you know, I mean, they talk about 1 billion dead, but I don't know if we know how many people were originally, you know, on the planet, or how many that leaves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was curious myself, like what exactly are the numbers? But I love that even a few members of this old guard are kind of like, we see it just towards the end that a couple of them are like, no, okay. Yeah, this Alon Gamor and this Dr. Parmack guy, yeah, maybe they have some good ideas. I'll listen, you know. We get Gullah Vec and Gullah Set kind of, oh, okay, yeah. So I just love that little hint that the wheel is turning, and that, you know, even people so enmeshed in the old way of doing things, even they are kind of coming around to this. And it ends on a hopeful note, which is really good. Definitely. So the other fundamental thing about Cardassian society, and we touched a little bit on Garak's spirituality, his burgeoning spirituality and that sort of thing, is the religion of the ancient Cardassian civilization, the Habitians, the first people to arise on Cardassia Prime. And they had this rich spiritual life centered around Aurelius, who is kind of their main religious figure. And that religion had been outlawed, but there are secret meetings happening throughout Cardassian history and in this book. And we see Garak kind of stumble upon one early on, and he goes back later with Palandine. And at various times in this book, he has very mixed feelings about this. We see from a few perspectives in his life how he feels about this. But, you know, by the end of the novel, this religion is playing a big role in Garak's life and possibly in the future of Cardassia. And I mean, we see more of that in other novels that come after this, but we definitely see the beginnings of it here. What do you guys think of this kind of ancient Cardassian religion and the role it plays in Garak's life in particular?
I found it a very interesting part of the novel, because I could be wrong, but I think these mentions that we get of this Cardassian religion, I don't know if there was a novel before that had talked about that, or any episode that had talked about that. So I think it's something that's introduced here almost as kind of a counterpart to the Bajoran religion a little bit. But you know, it seems like, you know, one of the important things about it is that Cardassian society has been about service to the state, right? And for this religion, this Oralian way, it's kind of like how you as an individual can connect, you know, with the universe around you, and to try to, you know, understand what's going on, not in the lens of how you can serve, you know, the state of your planet, but how you can, you know, find peace and understanding in your own life, and kind of, you know, bring that across to others. So I thought it was an interesting contrast. And at first, I think the first time I read this, I was kind of surprised that eventually Garak is kind of, you know, into it, and it's doing something good for him. But I think that, you know, in the same way that they're kind of turning the page onto a different type of Cardassian society, he's kind of turning the page in his own life, because the things that he could count on before also helped to destroy his society. So he's trying something different.
I also like that the religion uses masks with the leaders, and that the reflection on Cardassia itself is that Garak and others are naturally wearing masks. Not necessarily the physical mask, but they're always putting a facade of something different than who maybe they really are. And so I just thought it was interesting to see that an old society on Cardassia actually used masks, and that the current society dons a mask naturally.
An invisible mask. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, again, something that Andrew Robinson seems very good at is drawing parallels between different parts of his stories. And yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. Well, kind of the final point I wanted to talk about is Garak is a well-known liar and is called out by many people throughout his life in episodes of Deep Space Nine, and is something that he readily admits to and wears very proudly. So this book that we've read, is it all true? Or are they lies? Or as Garak would say, it's all true, especially the lies. How do we feel about his reliability here? Is this the ultimate true statement of what happened, or is there even such a thing? What's going on here?
Well, I think sometimes it can be difficult to say, what is, the 100% accurate truth, especially when you're writing about something that happened a long time ago in your life. But the way that I see it is, yes, I think that it is something that's reliable. I think, first of all, because this is something that he's writing to Bashir at a point in his life where he's really been able to examine his training, which was all about, I think the way that he puts it at one point is, finding the truth in the situation, even if it's a lie, right? Or what people are expecting you to say, or what you're expected to do is your own truth. But I think, again, like at this point, because he's really kind of writing these reminiscences in the post-war period, I think he's kind of turned the page on that part of his life. And also the way that things are depicted here, it doesn't feel self-serving for the most part. It feels like he's showing, all of the warts, all of the, humiliations he's had in his life. And it feels like it is the real story. Now, I think in some ways, for the post-war stuff, that might be a bit self-serving in order to make him look good at the end. But I think the things previous to that, I think, are him kind of bearing his soul to Bashir.
Wow, that's deep. I think that was really good. I think that these entries, the original entries of his past, I don't think were written for Bashir. And maybe that was his intent originally, and maybe self-consciously or something. I don't know. But I think he was keeping a journal for himself that he decides later to share with Bashir. But I almost picture there'd be a conversation if Bashir were to ask Garak, are these entries that you wrote, are they true? And I feel like Garak would say, well, Doctor, what is truth, but what is in the eye of the beholder? And what is written here is true from my point of view. And so it's almost like it could be true, and maybe, again, from what he wrote. I do believe it is true from his point of view for the most part. But at the same time, the novels aren't canon, so none of it's true.
Ooh. Well, it's interesting you say that, Bruce, because I always took it both times that I've read this, that those entries about his earlier life were... Okay, so there's three different parts. There's a post-war part, there's the earlier part, and the parts on the last year of the Dominion War. I took it as he's writing a lot of the earlier stuff in the post-war period because he's gotten that perspective on it. Because I don't think while he was studying at this institute, he would have been able to describe it in this way or have, all of these insights into it. But I do think the parts that take place in the last year of the Dominion War, he's doing that as it actually is happening because he's mature enough to give that perspective. No,
I agree with that. Yeah, I do think it was all written in the post-war period of time, but I don't think it was originally intended, at least the past incidents, the past memories that he's writing down were written for Bashir.
Because I always took it that it was his intent to do
that.
I
took that intent. The first time I read this, I remember that was my thinking, but the second time I read this, I didn't feel that way.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Because I thought, this is a lot to write just for one person. This is like 393 pages. I can't imagine writing anything for one person that's 393 pages. I felt like he was doing his memoirs and then decided he was going to share them with Bashir. And then
you don't feel like this book was written for you, Bruce?
Oh no, not at all.
No, I actually, it's funny you put that the way you did, Bruce, because that's exactly what I was thinking was, I don't know if this is true or not, but I really want to hear what Garak would say if you asked him if it was true, because that answer would be great. And yeah, no, that was, I feel kind of like you that, there are truths here and it's from Garak's perspective and it's as true as he can possibly make it, possibly. But, because the people that he's up against in the competition, for example, he assigns motives to their behavior that maybe, if we got the story from their perspective, it would be a lot different or something like that. That sort of question always is of interest to me because, there's truth and then there's your truth kind of thing. And I think Garak would be the first one to say that, like, what's truth exactly. So I don't know where that leaves us. I kind of talked to myself in a circle there.
I like to think if you were to ask Garak if what's in this book is true, that he'd just say yes. And then whoever would be asking the question would be like, really? I expected you to say something different. Like something really elaborate. He's like, no, at this point in my life, I'm just keeping it simple. Yes.
I'm just a simple tailor.
Excellent. Well, Justin, if I feel like I probably know where people are falling down on this book, but if you were to give this a rating and kind of your final thoughts, what would you say about A Stitch in Time?
Yeah, so for my final thoughts, I was really looking forward to talking about this and rereading it because out of all the Star Trek novels that I've read, it's about 140 now, this is in my top 3 of all of those. It's way, way high up there, along with Spock's World and the Destiny trilogy. Those 3 are my favorites. And rereading it confirmed it because there is so much that's, fascinating and complex. I mean, it is really true. We could talk about this for many more hours because I feel like Andrew Robinson has packed so much into the book and he writes so brilliantly. Like sometimes I'd read something, a couple of paragraphs, and I'd be like, wow, that's amazing. I need to reread that, because there are things that are so quotable and such amazing like insights. And there's a lot of complexity. I feel like even after reading it 2 times, there's probably, a lot of stuff, maybe even, half of what's intended to be there I'm not actually catching because I think there's a lot of different levels. So I think it's a brilliant book. I love it a lot. It was really fun rereading it. Garak's one of my favorite characters. It's just, a pleasure all the way around. So if I were to rate it, and again, I would only do this for a couple of books, I would rate it 11 out of 10 stimulating Garak conversations.
Wow.
10 is not high enough. I mean, really, that's how highly I think of this book.
That's a terrific rating. That's excellent. Especially since they're stimulating Garak conversations.
Yeah, you got to get that extra one in there.
Bruce, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so the first time I read this book, yes, Dan, like we talked about, there was the hype. I heard how great it was. I mean, this is a long time ago. I don't remember exactly what I was doing. I know where I was around that time in my life. Which I won't go into all the details. It wasn't really bad or anything. It was just a lot of different new things going on in my life. And I just remember reading this book and when I was done thinking like, okay, it was good, but I don't know why everybody's making such a big deal of it. And I do recall not just reading the book and getting through it like I did this time. It was like I read a part of it and then I'd put it down for like a week or 2. And then I read a little bit because there was just a lot of things I think going on at the time. And I wasn't really like just having the opportunity to just sit down and read it. So I don't think that really helped. Now, the second time I'm reading this, I read it pretty much in like a few days. And there were actually scenes that in my mind that I remembered that were not in the book. Like there were things that I was like, where's that scene? I could have sworn I remember there was a scene where blah, blah, blah happens. And I guess maybe I'm pulling that from other books. I don't know. I like the book much better this time. I thought it was great to read. I don't know what I was thinking years ago. I I would not say it's in my top 3 necessarily. I think one reason is because sometimes I have a problem with first-person books, the narrative when it's in a fictional, not fictional, but like in a tie-in universe. I've had that problem with Star Wars too, even there's been just a couple of those. And it's not that I had a problem with this one as much, but it's just not Star Trek in the sense that it's not, a ship and the crew and they're on an adventure. It's like a side story. It's a side character story from that, which is great, but it's not something that I would put as like my top 5 of Star Trek books, but I would put it up there. So that being said, I would give this a field filled with orchids everywhere.
Are they poisonous?
Beautiful.
Excellent. Be careful what you plant near those orchids, though. Just that rating could get very bad very fast.
And it's very telling that this book is selling for so much online. So,
yeah, definitely.
Dan.
Well, yeah. I mean, how to follow those ratings up. This is a terrific novel. I remember really enjoying it when I was younger and thinking it was very good. I hadn't read a ton of Star Trek novels at that time, but now that I've read dozens of them, I should count how many I've read now. But this one, again, I don't know if it's top 3, but it's definitely at least top 10 for me. I have personally a really hard time ranking things. I have, I don't like competition. I would do very badly at Bamarin, but I really love this novel. I think it's an incredible story. It's a very long story. There's a lot packed in there, but at the same time, there is not one single paragraph that is superfluous in this story. There's nothing I feel that you could take out. This is a tight story. It's a very personal story, and to hear it in Garak's own words, or as close as you could possibly get to that, with the voice of Andrew J. Robinson, and man, I can't stress this enough, how well he has captured that voice for very obvious reasons. This was just an incredible read, a heck of a lot of fun, and I would have to give it 5 solid hours in the pit, staring at your opponent before taking him down with a really awesome move because his attention wavered for just a second. It's that feeling. It's that good. So to wrap up, Justin, thank you so much for coming on with us. Where can people find you?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on the network, co-hosting Earl Grey with Amy Nelson and Richard Marquez. That's our dedicated Next Generation podcast, and we have a lot of fun on that podcast every week. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek. Currently tweeting out my Season 4 rewatch of The Next Generation. You can find me hanging around the Babel Conference on Facebook. And as I think I've mentioned before, there are a couple of Star Trek books and novels groups that I'm a part of. I think the Star Trek Books Community Group, the Star Trek Books Discussion Group, and literally Star Trek. So you can often find me there posting about the latest thing that I've read. So hope to see people around and talk about Star Trek books.
Well, dear Doctor, I hope you enjoyed our truthful conversation about Garak's past.
But what is the truth? You're not going to tell me, are you?
Why, Doctor, everything I tell you is truth, yet a lie. I don't know what I'm saying.
It's all the truth?
It's all
even
the
the lies?
Even the lies. Even the lies are truth.
Especially the lies.
Especially the lies. I want to work on a Garak imitation.
That's a tough one. I have tried in the past, and I'm not going to do any kind of actual Garak impression on this podcast because, that's a tough one. Only Andrew Robinson can capture Garak's voice, and it turns out that's true on paper as well as in real life. Although Una McCormick also does it, but man, Andrew Robinson's really good at it.
Do you think Una McCormick does an imitation of Garak? We should ask her next time she's on the show.
I could see her doing that. I bet you she does. As she's writing, she at least for sure hears it in her head and is doing some mannerisms. That's my guess.
Right.
Anyway,
I would think so. Yeah, probably.
Well, it's been a lot of fun talking about Una McCormick imitating Garak, but it's not the only thing that we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
Fan consensus has sort of said, look, third season is terrible and awful and woeful, and a lot of it is. But you go back and you watch it, and there's a lot of it that carries over. Like, there's a lot of stuff that is, I think of like as quintessentially Star Trek. That sort of you see develop over the course of the third season.
The 602 Club.
There was a lot of screaming involved. I'll start with... You know what I'm talking about.
Snowball! 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 Yes. No, I know what you mean.
No,
I did
a lot
too.
of, oh my god, it's a Demogorgon.
Warp 5.
He had to learn to not interfere, and it's painful, and that's what makes it such a powerful episode, so this is definitely a see it. Okay, next.
All right, sleeping dogs. While exploring a gas...
Skip it.
Okay. All right, so Shadows of I think we already know what this one is.
keep going with the sleeping dogs.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
It's like when Tyler was, explaining the situation and seeing it, and he was explaining it to Tyler, it's like he was almost apologizing for it. Like, I had to do this to save my life, and I'm still alive because I did this. But is he suffering guilt for that?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So be sure to check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're an Apple eater, then I hope you enjoy your apples. And if you're an Apple user, then be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and written review, because it helps people find the show. And if you're not an Apple user, well, we've got you covered as well, and you can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website, or reach out and grab that RSS link.
Well, if you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to each week, you don't need to have graduated the Bamarin Institute. You can just become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm to get all of the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, a high-ranking position in the Obsidian Order, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, distribute, and interrogate Procol Ducat on each of these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all of the details at patreon.com/trekfm.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show and all these wonderful things Dan has been saying relating to the book. And there are many ways you can do that. The best place is to join in the larger conversation in the Babel Conference. It's our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. And if you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website. It's trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Literary Treks, and it will come straight to us. And you can find us also on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
And special for Literary Treks, we have a Goodreads group where we have bookshelves with all of our previously covered books, as well as the currently reading section, so you know what's coming up for future shows and you can keep up with us. Plus great conversations happening about all the books and comics in the Star Trek literary universe. Just search for Literary Treks on Goodreads and click Join Group. There's nothing special about the group, it's just a plain, simple group. We'd like to thank Ken Tripp, Greg Rosier, Brandon Shemutala, and Justin Oser for their support of the Trek FM network and for being associate producers for Literary Treks as well. Now, Bruce, when you're not busy planting Adosian orchids and hopefully not assassinating a Romulan high-ranking official, where can we find you?
You can find me sent to Terrak Norb, where I'm now a tailor. And you can find me on Twitter at Admiral_Rex. And you can find me talking Star Wars, especially Star Wars The Last Jedi, on the Star Wars Report at StarWarsReport.com. And, of course, you can always find me in the Babel Conference. And, Dan, when you're not writing 3 tracks about your life, the past, the present, and not that long ago, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me taking a break from doing all that writing and sticking to just 140 characters or 280 or whatever it is on Twitter now at Kertrats. That's Kertrats. You can also find me on my YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/KertratsProductions, where I talk about, you guessed it, Star Trek. And you can find me on facebook.com/KertratsProductions and, of course, in the Babel Conference. Well, thank you all so much for listening. And until next time,
live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.